that we're going to talk about in a second and are important reservoirs for some of the insect species that have used the American chestnut are also on chinkapins, and chinkapins are possibly were even more abundant in certain environments in terms of a bloom, plant, and resource for bees than the American chestnut. So here is a chinkapin bloom, and this particular chinkapin is epituxin, and this is one of the chinkapins that I pulled Andreina renyi off. So Andreina renyi, I think I hadn't mentioned that before, that's the chestnut bee. And we'll talk a little bit more about its background, but I rarely see chinkapin, and mostly when I see chinkapin, it's like, oh, here is a residual chinkapin in the woods as I'm tromping through and it's not blooming. So the first time I saw chinkapin blooming, I knew that it attracted insects and bees, and I eagerly collected off it. I found some bees on it, some male bees, it turns out in that case, like I've never seen these before. And so, which is relatively uncommon. I'm right on the refuge, don't forget, where my lab is. And so looked them up, turns out it was Andreina renyi. I thought, oh, that's interesting. There are basically no records for Maryland, and poked around and you'll see some of the historical records, and became suspicious of some of the records on Castanea, that it might be a specialist and that we hadn't seen it in like 75 years, almost 100 years was the last legitimate record as far as I could tell. So we put out some calls and we asked some people to look at chinkapins and also chestnuts. And here's a chinkapin fruit. Is that the proper term? I'm not sure. Burr for certain, which has implications for some of the other specialist species. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the other species, but I do want to give a little background because this is a suite, to think about it as a suite of a community of other creatures that are using chestnut and have evolved so tightly in a lot of cases that that's their baby. Like no chestnut, these species disappear kind of thing. So worldwide, 12 species of chestnut. There's a question as to if any of these insects that are using chestnut are actually limited to one species of chestnut or can easily switch. So the whole notion of obligate American chestnut may just be, we haven't really spent a lot of time looking at chinkapins. So my suspicion is that they're crossing between both. I don't know. This is part of the mystery and things that need to be done, is to start looking at the whole suite of chestnut species. There's some literature out there. So for example, the weak, and again, incomplete, 60 species of Lepidoptera feeding on chestnuts or known to feed on chestnuts. Another chunk of literature mentioned 50 insect species feeding on chestnut. There's lots of ways you can do that. You can think of the things that attack seeds, the things that attack the phloem, the things that attack the xylem, and many other kinds of things. So again, another entire talk. A point though, is a lot of you have probably heard Doug Ptolemy talk about the relationship between native plants and Lepidoptera and birds, and how this is a very supportive system that gets circumvented when we plant non-native trees within our human environments. And that what he wants to see is particularly more oaks. Well, chestnuts basically are first of all, they're related to oaks. They're probably supporting as many Lepidoptera and other yummy bird food type species as oaks. It's something to add to your arsenal of why we should want to bring back chestnuts, is that they are also supportive of a much larger community than just do chestnuts for chestnut's sake types of arguments. So I throw that out there. There are some lists. Paul Oppler is the last person that I know within North America that really did a serious look at chestnut species, chestnut obligate species, and wrote up a list for the Lepidoptera, not any of the other groups, but the Lepidoptera. So this is something to add to your list of things to do, which is to do a focus study on who being insects, are why insects? Why not the fungi and other things too? Who depends on chestnuts? It's probably quite a bit longer list. So Paul had quite a number of species that were on chestnuts. He mentioned 7 species that he thought had gone extinct that were obligate. He, I think, mentioned American chestnut. I'm not sure if he was considering chinkapins. I can't recall. However, just showing the limitations of something like that, if you don't look, you don't find it. If it's obscure, you don't have people who can look and find it, type of thing. A lot of these Lepidoptera are little brown things that your Luna moth type of snap shooter people are not going to get. And you have to actually spend a lot of time looking on the tree, which is rare now for these things. Parallel world, same thing with Andreina rennie. So David Wagner, who's there in Connecticut at UConn, and Mr. Caterpillar, he has refound 2 of those 7 species with just his investigations. So there is a question whether these things really are extinct or we're just not looking enough. We've dialed away. I'm getting on my soapbox now. So we've dialed away from straight natural history, people who look at things to look at things and to investigate all this complexity and all these relationships, and to really specialize and drill into some of the obscure species of insects. So we should harbor and love our taxonomists and these natural history types and encourage it wherever it may express itself. It's like having a museum and putting that back into a lot of our university systems. Just as I mentioned, here's another species that theoretically is extinct. There are records in the 50s of this. This is a chestnut weevil, and check out the rostrum, it's called, but it's basically its nose, in which it needs to penetrate through the core burr into the seed to affect the laying of eggs and feeding. So quite spectacular. I'm going to say you could probably find this somewhere, but if you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. But you would have to be looking on chestnuts, and that's what I think is absent here. It's not going to be something people blunder into on iNaturalist very easily. But if we talk about at the end some focused investigation, some of these things I think would reemerge, and then everyone would get a medal for being a hero. So here's this picture of the general distribution of American chestnut, and here is what Wally LaBerge back in 70s, 80s, I'm not sure, who published about Andreina rennie. He was a person to write up. I think it had been perhaps originally described in the 20s, maybe, but he published some updated records. I should point out, if you can see my cursor here, that this record here, I did some investigating, and there's some interesting nerdy details. This is probably not a valid record. So if we look at this very much matches this. And if we think about, oh, these are also on Chinkapin, then if we go back to that Chinkapin map, then we likely have other records throughout these areas into Missouri that would have the species. Indeed, there's a coastal Georgia record for the species that almost undoubtedly is on a Chinkapin species, which occurs in the coastal plains happily, whereas American chestnuts are not happy with the coastal plain. If we look at the records, incomplete again, and a lot of junk in there. So I went through these, and there's a bunch of bad records, I would call them, for a variety of reasons. And so a re-investigation for the people out there who are taxonomists rather than chestnut huggers, we need to look at these specimens again. But the records that are very clearly in this group, here's the most recent one, 1935 Ohio. I haven't seen it, so it's possible it's not correct, but it's been around. Like, obviously it doesn't disappear completely and then show up almost 100 years later. These chestnut plants have been supporting it all along. This may be the last person who actually looked. So, and then everything else is earlier. You can see it goes into the 1800s if we look back at all the records. And there's not many. Those records from Wally LaBerge are a pretty good indication, because he would have addressed all these of what was known. And those are not very many dots on the map for a bug. But again, probably reflecting nobody is looking at blooming chestnut and chinkapins. First of all, chestnuts, the blooms are way up there, so it's also hard to collect off them in most cases. And then, although chestnut orchards are relatively easy, it turns out, because the lower branches are accessible, but you have to collect on them. And chinkapins, just one of those things that people largely ignore and are not capturing. If we look at our Maryland dates that for the species specimens we've caught, I forget how many we have, but let's call it 12. And so these are 2 instances where I blundered into chinkapin, blooming chinkapins, and we had relatively early dates, as you'll see, of, well, if we compare back here. So look at the dates here. Mostly the earliest date is middle of June, and then we have a whole series that are right on the edge and into July on there, which is matching the bloom periods, particularly in the northern parts of chestnut species. So in Maryland, and then last year I went to a local chestnut orchard that was being decommissioned, but still had some trees. Sure enough, there's this Andreina rennie again. So now all of a sudden we are finding them. I put out some call to the Rare Bee Network, and so people looked and they found them. So I think I'm missing other records. I'm wondering, Michael, whether you have had records. You probably have from Massachusetts, because you're good at finding those things, recent ones. But so we have Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut, Virginia, all basically people who learned about this, went out, found them, and I think nobody has been skunked. In other words, for example, the Pennsylvania record was someone who read one of my Facebook posts and said, "Oh, I've got a couple chestnut trees in my yard that he had grown because probably he's with the foundation or got them somewhere." He said, "I'll collect some bees." He sent me 2 bees, one of which was Andreina rennie. And then similar stories can be told about these other ones. It appears that this species, in addition to being highly tied to the genus, is also relatively common on that plant, on those blooms. And it may be that most orchards have this species, which is very interesting. And it'd be very interesting, hint, hint, to look at the patterns of occurrence across all the orchards in North America. So here's the bee. And the difficulty here in terms of in thinking about, well, how would people collect information about this? It's not like spot the bluebird. It's a tricky bee. Andreina species in New England alone are approaching 100 different species, and they all kind of look like this. I would point out a couple details here for those who care. We have a very, let's call it textured, I'm trying not to use jargon, but the rear end of the thorax is very heavily textured. There's a line that goes all the way across here, which out of context makes no sense to anybody. These big fur patches here that line the edges of these are called tergites, are a good indicator. This pattern of pitting on the area and how this area, this part of each of this tergites is recessed slightly, hard to see here. But again, these are hard to see. It's not like, oh, I can go out and just look at them. This rear end that's a little bit brownish may be good. This is about the size of a honeybee, a little bit less, I'd say. So we're talking about maybe 3/4 the size of a honeybee. So again, not a big thing. Our eyes don't resolve this. These are really high def pictures, all of which are available on our Flickr site, and you can download them and use them however you like. You don't need to do anything more than attribute them to us. We don't even require that. This expanded femur is a good indicator, but again, who would see that and who would even know to look? And we have a whole bunch of other species that fall into similar sorts of vibes and look and feels, particularly for the non-expert. Here's the face. It is known to have what are called shallow fovea. Good luck seeing that one. You can hardly see it in this picture, only if you kind of know what you're looking for.